Talking about the stewardship of the open source Riak.NET client, which is a mouthful. Who here knows about Riak? Yeah? Awesome database. I love it. The .NET client for that is also a pretty interesting story, and Luke will tell you all about it. Let me see. The upstairs session is open source hacking the core CLR. So if you wanted to see that, go upstairs. If you're okay with what's happening here, stay here. All right, thanks. I'm going to hand it over to Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. Good afternoon. My name is Luke Bakken. I'm going to talk a little bit about taking over ownership of an open source project from the community and turning it into an actual product that's supported by Basho Technologies. Earlier this year, a colleague of mine and I took over the Corrugated Iron project. It was a community.NET client for Riak and brought it in-house. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about projects I've been involved with in the past. Back at Tier 3, I was the lead developer for the Iron Foundry project, which brings .NET capabilities to Cloud Foundry, and that project is still actively maintained by CenturyLink Cloud. At Basho, I'm in charge of the React.NET client, and I've also helped out recently shipping our Node.js client, of all things. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about stewardship, and actually a lot that I have to say dovetails with what Jimmy said this morning, even though I'm coming from a different angle than him, as inheriting a project as opposed from starting it from scratch. You want to basically meet the needs of your users, and so I'm going to talk today about 3 different kinds of users for your software. You've got end users, so these are the people who are taking your code, your libraries to build something awesome on their own. They may not ever contribute anything back, but they're definitely a group to keep in mind as you are steering your project. Then you have developers who are potential contributors. This is a very important group of people because not only are they battle testing your software in production, but hopefully they're sending you pull requests and ideas for where you might want to take your software in the future. And I think this is a really important user to cater to because they're going to put your code through the paces that you hadn't thought of and even come up with ideas that you may never think to implement. Very, very useful group of people. And then, of course, yourself, owners. Jimmy talked a little bit about, writing software to scratch an itch, and it's really important that as an owner of a project, you actually enjoy working on it. So everything you do to improve your project should be to help yourself out, and by doing so, you're going to help out contributors, ideally, and your end users as well. So it's a sort of a synergistic relationship between these 3 users. Now, everybody here has been in one of these roles as a developer or an end user. And so I want you to keep that in mind as I'm talking about specific things that we did with the React.NET client that might apply to yourself in one of these roles. Okay, I want to talk just briefly about what Riak is. It's a distributed NoSQL database that acts mainly as a key value store, masterless architecture that runs on anywhere from 5 to hundreds of nodes. Our newest release has built-in conflict resolution so that if, depending on the type of data you're storing, the database will resolve conflicts should writes happen at the same time for you. It's really designed for high availability and failure scenarios where perhaps 30% of your nodes crash and your application is still able to write and read from the database. And then there's various querying options, including MapReduce, secondary indexes, and Solr document queries. So a client application, a client API connecting to Riak has to keep this in mind and provides a sort of a easier to use interface than just sending protocol buffer messages to the database. So we chose Corrugated Iron for a couple of reasons. Number one, because Jeremiah and OJ said they were looking for a new home, and also because it was the most complete client API library for us to use. So here's some history about the project. Jeremiah and OJ started it in 2011, worked on it for 2 years to produce the 1.4.2 release, which is the last official release. In 2013, Last year in May, they sent out a message to the mailing list saying, hey, you know, we're done with this project. We've got 50% of the 2.0 features done, and we need to find a new home. And I'm sure you've all seen messages like this for libraries you use where, you know, eventually a maintainer is just going to have to move on, like we all move on in our day jobs, where they just need a new challenge, and then somebody needs to step up to the plate and take over. Then this past January, a colleague of mine, Alex Moore, and I started working on the project full-time and delivered the 2.0 release in May. So one of the first things we did during the transfer process was to sort of take a look at the code, a look at the community, and a look at the project, and come up with an outline of what we needed to do to move it forward. So one of the first things that we were thankful for is the fact that Jeremiah and OJ kept really good track of all the assets they owned and all the secrets for those assets. So things like domain names, the NuGet package on NuGet.org, and anything necessary, GitHub repositories, anything necessary to transfer us, because you never know when your team is going to be out on a group hugs team building exercise in the Grand Canyon and all fall off the cliff. And if that happens, you better hope that somebody somewhere knows those passwords. And it made this whole process, you know, very easy for us. So again, if you're in charge of a project, it's good to keep these things around. So in the process of transferring ownership, the first thing was GitHub, and which made it very easy for us. Project was hosted on GitHub, one click of a button, and now Basho's the owner for the repository. It's great. The domain name itself. This is a very important asset to transfer ownership because the web is littered with links to documents on corrugatediron.org, and we want to make sure that when somebody visits an old document, it goes to the right place for us. NuGet, even though we did get credentials to access the Corrugated Iron NuGet package, it doesn't allow renames, so we had to start a new one ourselves. But one nice feature of NuGet is the tags that you can associate with the package, so we can continue to use Corrugated Iron as a tag, so when people search in the package manager console, the new client will still come up. We had some miscellaneous tasks. I set up Google Analytics for the wiki pages. You know, projects like to keep track of their activity. That's one way to do it. My colleague Alex looked at the existing build infrastructure and found it lacking. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then last but certainly not least is copyright, which is associated with licensing, but is a different entity, right? So as of today, Jeremiah and OJ still actually have the copyright to Corrugated Iron. We're in the process of sending letters and getting lawyers involved to transfer it to us. But the code was Apache licensed, so basically what we've done is fork it, even though not really forking it, and marking our changes with the correct attribution as required by the license. Okay, so state of the code. How was the code base holding up when we inherited it? So here we have an example of the licensing requirements that were necessary when you modify a file. I'm not a lawyer, but my reading of the Apache license is that when you modify a file or fork a project, you need to include a copy of the original license and make it clear that when you've made a change, to another user can see that a change has been made. So what we would do is add a notice that Basho Technologies has modified the file. Hosting, GitHub. Great, no problem. Transferred ownership, people can clone, and actually one relatively new feature on GitHub is that the old repository automatically redirects to the new one. GitHub didn't used to do that. Continuous integration. At the time we inherited it, Corrugated Iron had a mono build on Travis CI that was not working, and a Team City build on Windows that also wasn't working. So we ended up fixing the Travis CI build because that's important to have a public build somewhere. And Team City we just nuked and brought the Windows build in-house using Basho's build infrastructure. And actually we use BuildBot, which is a good complete build infrastructure on Python. Thankfully, BuildBot has great documentation for end users like myself, and getting the Python Windows service running up up and running was actually pretty easy, thanks to the documentation, and more on documentation later. That is very important. Issue and feature tracking was all taken care of on GitHub, which is great. When we inherited the project, there was a huge feature backlog and a couple really large pull requests. And anybody who's been in charge of an open source project knows that an end user and a contributor, they'll get very zealous and they'll want to rewrite everything. And we inherited a couple pull requests that were basically touched every file in the library. And they were good changes. They're changes that we intend to make in the future. But obviously, something like that can't be accepted all at once. So we were very as polite as possible in declining them. And as an ownership of a project, as an owner of a project, you will have to do that more often than you will have to accept a pull request. The build process itself was good. I mean, by my definition of good, you could clone the repository, open the solution, and build a project, which is more than I can say for a lot of projects out there. And that's a really important thing to have if you want contributors, because your first, people always talk about first impressions mattering. And your first impression as somebody who might be a contributor to an open source project is you clone the repository and you try to build it. And if that does not work well, I bet half of your potential contributors will walk away or more. So what we had to do was clean up the build process a bit, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the main issue with the build process we inherited was that there were several different scripts for several different tasks. Some of the tasks involved manual processes, which of course are prone to error. And then last but certainly not least, support for Riak. Riak 2.0 was a release long in the making, 2 years, introduced a lot of new features and changed some existing features. So the 2.0 support in the library was only about 50%, which of course was a priority for us to address while maintaining backwards compatibility. Okay, so improvements for developers. So not just your potential contributors, but for yourself as an owner, right? So I really, really strongly believe in clone it and build it, where somebody clones your repository and either by double-clicking make.command or for mono running GNU make or opening a solution that the build works the first time. Very important. I'd like to think of your build process as like the Ronco rotisserie, right? You set it and you forget it. And we have a slightly more challenging build environment to support Windows and Mono. And so my decision was to use MS Build with all of its XML headaches to just invest the time up front to get the build process working on both as much shared code as possible to make it reliable. Another goal, along with using MS Build, was to make the project use as few dependencies as possible, and all dependencies are either checked into the repository or downloaded via NuGet during the build process. Again, that really lowers friction for potential contributors to your project because they literally just don't have to think about that. They can focus on contributing code and ideas. You might not think of this as useful for developers. You might think of it as kind of a headache, code analysis. It is a headache to implement initially because you will have thousands of warnings and thousands of build errors, and it will take a long time to address all of them. But it's one of those things where time invested up front will pay itself back later on, because when somebody wants to open a pull request against your code, the StyleCop will make sure that they're following your coding conventions. FxCop will hopefully catch common mistakes. We found, I suppose every project runs into this. FxCop catches iDisposable not implemented correctly, for instance. Very important to have these run as part of every build that you do. And unfortunately, FxCop is not redistributable, so it only runs if it's present on the user's machine. The test suite, the client we inherited did have a great test suite. Some of the integration tests were broken either due to changes in Riak or because Riak, due to its eventually consistent nature, doesn't always guarantee a response that you might expect. And I feel like it's polite to your contributors to have a test suite that works correctly every time. So we put in time to make sure that when you run the integration test against Riak, you're going to have success. And if you do have a failure, it really does mean it's an actual failure and not something wrong with your environment. To go along with helping out with the test suite, we put together a support script so that a contributor can run it and have their Riak cluster configured correctly to run the integration suite. So rather than give them instructions for how to edit 10 different configuration files, one for each node, get all the settings correct, this reduces their friction in contributing to your project by letting them know, I'm going to run these scripts and my database is going to be set up like the project owners expect. And so if there's a failure, I know it's not due to my environment, or very unlikely it's due to my environment. One other feature in 2.0 is security over TLS sockets, which requires SSL certificates, which, as we all know, it's a giant pain in the butt to build. So another tool that we provide to our contributors is a set of test certificates, as well as all the commands documented should they need to build more certificates. It's kind of, I feel like it's being polite to your contributors so that they don't have to read what OpenSSL command do I run to generate this x509.pem file. They don't need to know that. Okay, release automation, and this is something that Jimmy talked about earlier today, and I'm totally going to rip him off with the release notes because I don't have that part automated yet. But the original release process for Corrugated Iron involved manually tagging the repository, building your NuGet package with one script, uploading it via a command line script, a bunch of different things, right? And the more moving parts you have, the more chances you're going to make a mistake. And a release of your project should be the one thing, or at least one of the top things, you don't want to make a mistake on. So what we did was automate it so that literally you have to run one command, and you will have we'll have Git tagged correctly, we'll have NuGet updated, and release published in GitHub. And later this week, we will also have release notes because I'm going to add that. That was a great idea. The repository itself, we decided to clean up with the BFG. And if you're not familiar with this tool, it's a really great Scala Java application that you can run against a Git repository to remove large objects from your history. And what it does is it deletes the large objects and leaves a marker in place. You are actually changing your Git history, so you don't want to remove something you really need. But what happened for us is the repository went from 20 megabytes down to 4 because of all of the DLLs that had been checked in the packages directory in the history. And this probably doesn't seem like that big of a deal, right? But not everybody on the planet has high-speed internet. And again, as part of that initial first impression, I believe at least, when somebody clones your repository, if they don't have high-speed internet and it takes a minute or two, they may be, or not likely at all, willing to contribute. Plus, it speeds up your continuous integration process because each build takes that much less time. So for end users, so these are the people that are just using the Riak client to connect to Riak and may not be contributors, but they're very important, obviously, because they're the ones who are hopefully paying for Riak at some point. We created, like I mentioned earlier, Riak client as a new NuGet project using Corrugated Iron as one of the tags so people can find it, should they be looking for Corrugated Iron. We did implement all the features necessary for Riak 2.0 support in I like to call it 99% backwards compatible fashion. There were some features dropped completely out of Riak, so they were dropped out of the library, and other features that are planned as deprecated in Riak are also marked as obsolete in the library, so that the users know that at some point in the future they're going to lose this. However, I did not put our release notes could be better in this regard, especially after talking to what Jimmy said this morning about AutoMapper. So that's definitely on my to-do list. One thing that we added was CLS Compliance, which perhaps nobody cares about because I suspect most if not all of the .NET client users are writing applications in C#. But if there's the rogue Iron Python or F# user out there, they'll appreciate that. And basically, CLS compliance for us meant getting rid of all of our unsigned types. And then last, but certainly not least, is documentation, which for us turned out to be extremely painful because there wasn't any API documentation in the form of XML comments at all. So my colleague Alex, I don't know how I convinced him to do it, but he spent a week and added literally thousands of lines of documentation that we then turned into online docs via Sandcastle. We also took the content from the old website, corrugatediron.org, moved it into the GitHub wiki, and set up redirects for the old domain to the GitHub wiki. So if you go to corrugatediron.org/help, it's going to redirect you to the new place. So that preserves knowledge that maybe on Stack Overflow from 3 years ago. Another bit of wisdom I might pass on about documentation is to start now and not leave it till the week before release, because then you'll just end up hating everything. So here's an example of the API documentation. I went through the documentation on docs.basho.com and made sure that all of our code examples had C# examples as well. This is a huge time. I mean, it took a long time to build this documentation, but it will hopefully pay me back with not having to answer questions on the mailing list for, how do I persist an object in React? How do I serialize things? Because this should all be on our documentation. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the corrugatediron.org site was transferred over to GitHub Wiki, which works great. Oh, one other thing I want to mention about documentation. One conscious decision we made when rewriting the documents was to remove words like simply and easily and sort of presto. This is easy to do, right? Because even though as a project owner, a concept or a bit of code might be simple to you, it's not simple to your end user because they're the ones looking at the documentation. And I personally feel like it's sort of condescending to say something should be easy or simple when in fact it may not be. So to summarize, like I just said, documentation matters, and it's it's the least sexy thing that developers do, but in terms of maintenance for yourself, in terms of community maintenance, it really does pay itself back in spades in the future, and your users will appreciate it. And then project activity matters. So Jimmy this morning said something about how your project gets to a certain done state, and then people start asking if it's dead. And it's true. When as an end user, when I go to GitHub to look for software to use for my project, for whatever I need to do, what are the two things I look at first? I look at the last commit date, and I look to see if there's a passing build. And right or wrong, I will dismiss an entire project. It might be the most awesome thing in the world if the build is failing or if the last commit was 2 years ago. Is that fair? Probably not, but that's generally what people are going to do. So I really strongly believe the project activity matters. Build status and last commit date. So I'd like to invite anybody interested in contributing to open a pull request, submit ideas, send a hi, say thanks. It's great to hear from any end users you got. And so I'd like to thank .NET Fringe for inviting me here. And I suspect we have some time for any questions if anybody has any. Oh, I guess not. Troy's saying no questions. So, thank you very much.